We have parents calling from Texas right now, more than one, asking about schools, asking about Boulder and Boulder County because they have to leave Texas. And I think we'll see this. And that's one of the things I think for organizing that makes it really hard is that when you have good people leaving states because they're not safe, like who's left?
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean Fettig. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in how our government and our politicians influence our lives, but also how our personal stories influence our politics. In this podcast, I often focus on topics in the news, but this is not punditry. Instead, I dive deep into issues and stories with my guests, behind the headlines, beyond the basic narrative that is often crafted by the media and our politicians, to help us better understand each other and why we think and feel the ways we do. Welcome to the second episode in Deep Dive Special Pride Month week. I know that it's July, but I'm pushing boundaries. Earlier this week, I spoke with Duncan Tucker about his movie Transamerica, which came out in 2005 and broke many barriers, especially as it relates to how queer identities are and can be represented on screen. Between then and now, the queer community has experienced many successes, with the legalization of same-sex marriage countrywide in 2015 with the Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, and Gallup reporting a greater than 30% shift in public opinion between 2005, when Transamerica was released, and now in support of same-sex marriage, from 37% to 70%. After my discussion last week, it made me wonder about the state of queer rights in the United States now. This year, the Republican Party has thrown all in on an anti-gay agenda. Republican-led legislatures, governors, and school boards across the country have been banning queer-related books, locking out, in fact criminalizing, health care for trans kids, and outlawing any discussion of queer issues in schools. So I've reached out to a friend of mine, Mardi Moore, the executive director of Out Boulder County in Colorado, an organization in Boulder that facilitates connection, advocacy, education, research, and programming for queer people. We discuss the work that they do, the issues that she and Out Boulder County are confronting in light of this Republican agenda, and ways that the rest of us can contribute and help. Let's do a deep dive. Mardi Moore, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. I'm so excited to be with you today, Sean.
Let's just jump right in. We have limited time, and there's so much that I want to talk to you about. Before coming to Out Boulder, well, it's Out Boulder County now, but it was Out Boulder then. You worked in queer activism in other capacities and organizations. So what did you do before coming to Out Boulder? And then, why this line of work?
It's been an interesting road. In the 90s, so I came out at the onset of, I think we called it ARC before it was AIDS. I was in college in the 80s and had some activism then because I just was facing, discrimination was real. It was obvious in daily life, and cut my teeth in AIDS activism. I certainly wasn't a member of ACT UP, but I did my own work in fundraising for organizations that were working to save lives, address the pandemic of that time, and really got started there. And I don't have a social work degree, but I've been a bit of a social worker through my life. And, maybe that's because of being raised in an alcoholic home, always wanting to fix something or help somebody. But that's another podcast. But I hired a group. We called ourselves the Island of Misfit Toys. And I ran an organization for, I think it was 17 years, something like that, called MJM and Associates. And we were in Seattle. And we did fundraising for social justice organizations, everybody from food and racial justice to AIDS organizations. So I did that for a long time and was married to a woman and raised a couple of great kids. And when that all ended, I sold my kids are still great, but the marriage ended and I sold my business. And it was like 2008. And I had signed a non-compete. The economic world was falling apart. And I ended up going to New York City, which I'd never even visited before, and taking a job with at that time, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, which I had always followed, had always been aware of their work for the majority of my life, and started working in New York City for the task force doing national work, and was there for a few years, and then got hired away by the LGBT Center in New York City, and did that. And then I ended up, my dad died unexpectedly. My family's from Colorado. I grew up in Colorado. And then 8 hours later, my grandmother died, non-related. And I thought, I need to get back home. And the job at Out Boulder was open. So I interviewed the Monday before the flood. Actually, that day, the rain started, and came to Boulder shortly after the flood in 2013.
Actually, I came a year after that, I think. I was like 2014. So you were relatively new then in that position.
Yeah, brand new. And I came into an organization that probably should have shut its doors. There was no funding, very little programming. There was a staff of like 2 and a quarter. The youth program was the one solid thing that was going on in the newsletter. That Pride had been scheduled when the flood happened, so there wasn't that income. And it was touch and go for a couple of years in ensuring we had funding to carry on.
You oversaw a lot of growth, and you went from Out Boulder to Out Boulder County, and you have a lot of programming now. So tell me about that.
We have a ton of programming, and so the federal government still knows this as Boulder Pride. So Boulder Pride, started in the early 90s before Amendment 2. They weren't formalized until 1994, but a group of people got together and started providing services. There was our phone number still, 303-499-5777. I just recently learned that was the original hotline that people could call who needed support in whatever area they needed support. So they had started this work, and then Amendment 2 happened, and all the energy went to beating back that amendment.
Which was what? What's Amendment 2?
Amendment 2 was when the state of Colorado, when voters in the state of Colorado, in a public vote, decided that I think it was gay and lesbian in particular, people should not have any rights, any accommodations, that we were second-class citizens and didn't really exist. And so your neighbor voted against you. And it was pretty devastating to the community. Glenda Russell has written a book about the psychological impact that it had on the queer community here in the 90s. And so a lot of organizations really were founded shortly after Evans versus Romer. Gene Dabowski argued in front of the Supreme Court, and the law was never implemented, thank God. But there was a lot of fallout. And recently I was talking to Lynn Earhart, who was one of the original members of Boulder Pride. And she told me that in 1990 or 91, before that vote, that they had circulated in paper, of course, a long survey about what members in Boulder County wanted in the community center. And so the work had started early. It started with the shortest parade ever down Pearl Street. I still have the baton. I don't know who carried it in that parade, but the work started there. And when I got here in 2013, there had been some really good work done. Obviously, from the beginning through the youth program, through securing a house, the Pride House, and running a variety of programming, partnering with Latino organizations for movies, conversations around racism in our community, strong board of directors over the many years. And so when I got here in 2013, I had a base, but I didn't have any way to keep it rolling. We had received money from the Gill Foundation for years. And when I was at the National LGBT, now it's called the National LGBTQ Task Force, Gill Foundation had been a major funder of the task force and other large organizations, and had given notice that they were switching the way they funded. And So at the task force, we actually people lost their jobs as they started planning for the loss of that funding. Well, the year I got here was the last year of funding from the Gill Foundation, which is how they originally got into the little Pride House, was through knowing that they were going to receive $15,000 a year. So there were some funders who were still around. The Community Foundation of Boulder County, the Open Door Fund, had been a key funder for the organization. But when I took the job, it had been sold as an LGBT organization that served Boulder County. And what it felt like in programming was a gay and lesbian organization that served the city of Boulder. So, that's not wholly true, but there was trans programming. There was a trans support group that's still up and running strong. But the trans community had that support group and weren't really fully invested in Out Boulder County. So that took time and effort to build trust, to change systems that were barriers that were set up for trans communities' inclusion in things like the garden party or different events, for simple things like, how am I going to use the restroom? Am I going to walk into the space and be misgendered over and over again? So through conversations with trans people, we began changing that. And then it was a matter of Boulder County. So I had a donor come forward, I can't remember the year, Sean, and said, if I give you $1,000 a month, will you open an office in Longmont? And I said, I'll do it. So we found a small space, 463 Main Street, was where our first office was in Longmont. And we started some programming out of there. And the office was too small. We had outgrown it. I had safety concerns about it because there was no way out a back door. So we ended up finding a larger space, which is now, which we had, and we started having youth groups there and the knitting group there, and people could walk in and find resources and community. But during the pandemic, that lease came up, and we had 2 leases. We couldn't inhabit either one of them. The Boulder office, we had just signed a new 10-year lease. And the landlord, who's a nice guy, just wouldn't negotiate with me on price. So we board and myself decided that we were going to close that office. So we closed that office, but continue programming. Longmont Pride is coming up on June 11th. The knitting group meets here. We have a youth group that meets in Longmont, and a variety of programs, as well as, we serve Lafayette, Louisville, Lyons, Jamestown, Nederland. Boulder County is a pretty big place, and each town has its own personality. So it's a lot of work. When I moved back here from New York City, when I was living in New York City, I realized that cities have beats. And I learned that when I would travel away from New York City and I would come back and get on the sidewalk and get run over until I started really paying attention to the beat. Well, when I got to Boulder, I'm like, 6 months in, I'm like, I cannot find the beat of the city. And someone said to me, Marty, in Boulder, everyone has their own beat. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. And so it's an interesting place to organize. It's rural. It's urban. It is a strong Republican base, little extreme in my opinion, a strong liberal base, and a strong, I guess I would call it even, there's anarchists alive and well in Boulder County. So it's a real mix.
In 2015, after the Obergefell decision out of SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, I remember having discussions. They were almost existential. And I remember even talking to you about this, in which a lot of folks that were active in the queer community were then questioning, what's the purpose of the work anymore? And a lot of organizations kind of just closed up shop. Money stopped coming. And at the same time, some people, and again, you included, were saying that trans-related issues were probably or could be the next front line, that they would be the next targets. But it just didn't really seem to sink in. And my personal take is that, at least in part, there was a lot of money in programming that was held by white men in the queer community that simply, got theirs in Obergefell. And when they did, the money kind of dried up. But what are your thoughts? And in hindsight, what happened? What went wrong?
Well, I would totally agree with you that they got theirs, and so the money went home. They're apparently, and like I've never been invited to the table, but there's something called the kitchen cabinet that is a group of people who hold resources, who determine the direction of the queer movement. And I think they had all thrown in to marriage rights. And the money, organizations did close. Out Boulder County has never been a single issue organization. So, excited for the couples who are married, who have those 1,400 plus rights. But there are communities that have been left behind. Marriage wasn't the issue. Apparently, at the national level, there was quite a bit of concern when the powers that be decided they were going for marriage. And the fight was, what about health? Like the larger issues that were left out of healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think now you hear, Out Boulder included, we have been working very hard on health equity and the social determinants of health. But I think that, you and I were right back then when we said the next mountain is trans rights. And as you look around the country today, and I've lost count of how many states and how many pieces of legislation have been put out there to try to wipe trans people from any services, any support. I mean, the attacks are hideous. We have parents calling from Texas right now, more than one, asking about schools, asking about Boulder and Boulder County because they have to leave Texas. And I think we'll see this. And that's one of the things I think for organizing that makes it really hard is that when you have good people leaving states because they're not safe, like who's left? Are all the voters in Florida, going to end up being as hateful as the majority right now? But, we're seeing that. And we continue to work on trans issues. We have a trans advisory committee that meets monthly, talks about issues, brings those to staff to think about programs and implementation. But I think that health equity, trans rights, but, now with Roe versus Wade going and all the, I'm no lawyer, but marriage rights are going to be on the line as far as I can figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And also the narrative. And one of the things that we face is that somehow people think trans men can't get pregnant. And that whole conversation, even with good people, is difficult. And I think I've helped 2 trans men in my tenure here seek abortion services. So the whole there's reframing that needs to be done in this fight, so we can all see our piece in the fight. But it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And after the ascension of Donald Trump, we actually may be taking 1 step forward, 2 steps back for the next 20, 25 years because of all the judicial appointments that he made.
I want to follow this line of thinking related to, the calls that you're getting from folks in other states that are taking a hard right turn. And also this idea that, staying in that space is probably also equally important. So I think like trans issues and trans folks are relatively common in very, let's just call them blue parts of the country. And you and I currently live in them. I'm on the coast. I'm in Seattle and you're in Boulder. But, I grew up in the Midwest and I still, I have family there and I have close ties to community there where trans folks are a lot less visible. And as a result, they're less integrated into the kind of everyday social lives of folks. And this can make those of us that live in these blue zones and on the coast and in Boulder, I think, less prepared for political and I suppose policy and physical, like direct physical attacks on the trans community. So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts about this and how to direct resources in such a way as to beef up that education and exposure?
I've always been a believer that you fund a local LGBT group, a state LGBT group, and a national LGBT group. Because I think it takes all of us working together. But the problem becomes that those groups become siloed. And I think part of it is lack of funding. And I also think there's this thing that happens in LGBT groups. And I try very hard not to be one of those people. Collaboration isn't king, right? And there's this feeling of scarcity of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though I continue to do those three things, there doesn't seem to be any conversation between the three that makes sense. Creating Change, that important conference that the task force does, has been virtual for 3 years now, I think. And what a loss in conversations about issues and how we can work across county lines, state lines. And, Equality Florida is a fantastic organization. They are working hard down there. It all comes down to voting, though, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And, even thinking about Roe versus Wade, I mean, even if you believe Donald Trump was this great businessman and we're all going to do better economically if he's elected, and you have a conversation with somebody and say, but what about the Supreme Court appointments? And I've done this over my lifetime with people, family, classmates, and they're like, that's not that important. Well, here we sit with the Supreme Court that's going to roll us back to 40?
Mm-hmm.
How do you have a national movement? And I think, recently with the loss of Urvashi, she was one of those people, who saw the big picture. And I was reading an interview, or maybe it was one of the obituaries, that she had been a founder of the Equality Federation. And the Equality Federation, of which I'm not a part of, but it seems to bring leaders together of statewide groups to have conversations. And if they're doing that, that information isn't getting out. And I'm not just, speaking in Colorado. I don't know that in any state that information then gets to the local front.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that all politics are local.
I mean, and I'll fully admit, I am one of those people who grew up in a place that with very low visibility and very low access and exposure. And I remember going to, I grew up in a town called Fond du Lac in Wisconsin, which was rural. Milwaukee was about 60 miles away. And even Milwaukee, for all intents and purposes, I don't know if you've ever been, it's if you place Milwaukee against something like Chicago or New York, it's rural.
Right.
And I remember going to Chicago and being, I was a queer kid and still I didn't speak the language because of where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a certain amount, I think, of like, oh, this kid doesn't even know how to speak gay, I mean, I remember, this is so embarrassing, but I had been in Milwaukee at university for a couple of years, and I had heard probably through one of the queer orgs that a rural town in northern Wisconsin was planning to start an LGBT community support group, and they were looking for volunteers to help them kind of organize and structure this thing. So I went to the initial meeting of like 8 people, and right off the bat, they asked everyone to introduce themselves and name one thing that they had to offer in this effort. So, people around the table were like, a youth coordinator at the town community center and a social worker. And everyone's like this, right? And hardcore deserve to be there. And it gets to me and I say, well, I'm not really typically gay, whatever that even means. So I offer something other than maybe what people might expect. But like Mardi, having had no exposure, like that's how I thought about myself. And that's how I thought about, being gay. They very kindly just didn't invite me back. And it would have been so important for me to have people that represented that in my community.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first opportunity I had, I fled. Right. And
yeah.
I went to what I consider safe zones. I went to the blue zones. I went to Boulder, Portland, and now Seattle. But I still carry with me this idea. And you touched on this earlier of like, if everyone flees, then who's left? Right. Like, do these places just become more extreme?
And I think they do. And recently I went, traveled down to my hometown. So I come from a town of 3,000 people. And now it's much less than that for a variety of reasons, which isn't the point of this podcast. But anyway, I was down there and had met with somebody who's in government. And having a conversation, and I'm not going to out them on this podcast, but I have reported them. And so we're sitting in this conversation, and this woman says, out of the blue, as we're having a conversation about the health of the community.
Mhm.
She said, well, my daughter teaches in such and such town, which is this tiny, tiny town, about 6 miles from where I grew up. And she brought in that book, Irreversible Damage. And I'm like, what? And so she goes on about it. And I said, well, are there a lot of trans kids in this little town? And she said, not anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was the number we were beginning with? Did they run
Right.
out one trans kid?
Yeah. That's what rural America looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think if I had my druthers, I'd be a rural organizer. I always wanted that job. And I think that that's where the work is. Here in Boulder County, we have trouble. Trans hate crimes against gay men. In my tenure, all those things have happened. And with trans people in particular, there have been more than one. So I'm not saying everything's like, butterflies and rainbows here by any stretch of the imagination. But when you get into the rural parts of this country, you can't even be seen. And, I was lucky, maybe I'm like thinking it's lucky now, but I didn't come out in high school. And because I just thought I was a pervert.
Mm-hmm. It was the same. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'm just a pervert, and don't tell anybody that you're having thoughts or feelings like this. And, and now with the internet, and because they do have internet in most rural communities, it may not be stable or, 24/7, but kids do have connection. They have more of a sense of themselves. And had I had that information earlier, I don't know if I would have come out or not, because it was not safe.
Yeah. I had this, not the exact same conversation, but the same line of conversation with someone else about the internet and the power of the internet, and something that I completely missed, which was, so when I was coming out, which I came out between high school and university, which
Me too. Yep.
yeah. And then university was a whole new world for me as a result of that. But, and the internet, that was also at the same time that the internet was, it was like 2000. And as a result, not only, I went to university in a bigger city, and I was introduced to, a whole range of folks that, blew my mind, but also the internet, I was able to meet folks that, not even across the world, but within the same city or a few miles away that I would never have known otherwise. And I remember thinking, like, what a great democratizing tool that the internet is. And what I totally missed and didn't see coming was how this was also being used by, right-wing, white supremacist, authoritarian folks to also, coalesce and organize. And how do we leverage something like the internet to counter that and also provide safe space when, it's sucking out all the oxygen out of the room, right? Like all the internet is now is this entirely like vapid sandbox for violence, it seems.
I don't know how you stop it, Sean. I spend a lot less time on social media anymore. Mm-hmm. And, maybe it is also becoming something that's going to end up being for the fanatics. I don't know. I think youth, there's something called Discord now, which is what all the cool kids are using, the young people. And we have a 200 youth in our Discord channel. And they're getting positive stuff, right? It's a moderated, we keep an eye on it. The youth staff does, but it's a way for youth to connect. We have youth who are coming from Fort Collins or Greeley for their parents or are driving them down, or if they can drive, they bring themselves down to youth group. Mm-hmm. We are the safe place in the middle of, 200 miles north of us, 100 miles north of us, there's not anything going on.
Right.
So I don't, and they found out about it through the internet. So there's positives on it, but that's something that I have no idea how they're going to address. And I'm not Like, where are the rules around this? Where does free speech, very important. Hate speech, like, there's a lot of that going on, and it doesn't seem to be being addressed.
I suppose to some degree, this is also a question about like in preparation for, queer activism, but also specific to Out Boulder County. What's your take on the next kind of political and legal fronts for queer folks? And then I suppose specific to the trans community, do you think this plays out in the same way as it did for, I guess, the other letters, the LGBT community, with gradual progress and then a huge flare just before some kind of legal acceptance? Or do you expect this to be different given kind of the current political landscape? And if so, what does that look like for you?
I feel like we play defense a lot, and I've been waiting for a national LGBT leader to say, this is the direction we need to head. And that hasn't happened. I've gotten a little bit frustrated with that.
Who would be one? I mean, I've racked my brain on this too. Like, not just even an LGBT leader, but, a progressive leader. Like, who is one?
I don't know anymore. I don't know that we have one. I think that one of the things that I think is that our community, all these letters, we're as divided, allies like the LGBT community. I'm a supporter of that. And it's like, I'm in the LGBT community and there's so much division within the LGBTQ community that I don't know if it's possible to come out with one thread of what we're going to run. What is that one issue? Marriage rights, of course, money will come pouring forward if the court Roe versus Wade drops and then they find some, Kentucky county clerk, was her name Kim Davis or something, some case there where they gin up to the Supreme Court and things are overturned for marriage rights. Very possible. And is that where the fight becomes? But this playing defense all the time doesn't work. It does not propel anybody forward. And this year, for the first time, Out Boulder County ran legislation. And we ran legislation and got it passed. We're waiting for the governor's signature as we speak. That will include sexual orientation, gender identity, along with disability, race, and ethnicity in legislation that requires the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment to collect information. Now, I don't have to fill it out. If I'm living in rural America and I don't want to check lesbian because I know somebody's going to see that, I don't have to check it. But we're going to start collecting data because we are unseen at the federal government level by design. Organizations have been trying for decades to get us in the census. We don't have any political power at the levels that we need it because we don't have data. And we're the fifth or sixth state in the nation to pass this. I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to have some tremendous positive effects for our community, which will, if you have numbers, funders love to give you money. If you don't have any numbers, then they question your effectiveness. And so, I think that it's continuing to work step by step for inclusion is probably where the next is. We have a strong training program Mikkel Duffy runs for us, and they do trainings all over around inclusion. Corporations want to do the right thing, and I don't think it's necessarily just because they want a bigger market share. I think they want to retain good people, and that a lot of corporate leaders are good people, not all. And so, as I think about what's going on in Florida, I'm thinking about who are the major corporations. Well, we know Disney, right? And we know what's happening with them. But who are the organizations that are going to step forward? Remember years ago when I think it was North Carolina was running some hideous bathroom bill and Salesforce said, we're not going to come. We're not going to build this new facility unless you stop this madness. And we help organizations, people form employee resource groups within corporations. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a gathering of it'll probably be 30 different corporations in the room. And I think that's the question is, like, if you're part of a corporation, and I'm working in Boulder, but my organization also has another headquarters in Houston, Texas, or in Tallahassee. Speak out, right? We've got to figure out how to speak out against these people. And I think corporations, and it's unfortunate, but I think corporations may be one of our last ways to stop some of these hateful pieces from going forward.
Actually, I agree with you. You've said a few things, or a couple of things in there that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And this is one of them, which is, and it seems, I don't know if the word's ironic, because I think 20 years ago, I would have squarely placed corporations, small and large, as being mountains to climb and challenges. And I think I agree with you that they are also potentially one of the strongest, if not the strongest forces, if they could become a monolith and act in concert with each other, that could counter some of this. But it remains to be seen, I suppose.
It does, but we have seen, we know we have some good leaders. Yeah, and so I'm hoping bringing folks together in the next couple of weeks to have these conversations and to find out who has headquarters where, and to start doing that internal pressure on the large corporation to speak out. I think that's all we've got left, Sean, because we know that the political system is so broken right now. History shows that we're going to lose seats in this midterm election. If we don't, it'll be some kind of, anomaly. It'll be like the horse that won the Kentucky Derby. There's an 80 to 1 shot that we won't. And so what happens then? Right? What's left then? We can protest all we want. It doesn't change anything anymore.
I've also been thinking about this offense versus defense that we've been playing. And I've been thinking about it in the context. I was just thinking about this morning, actually, in the context of Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade established the, legal right to have an abortion. So I'm like, we've been playing in that sandbox. To flip that script, what does the offense, I suppose, look like? And this is in no way to say this places us in good space, but I'm wondering, do we then, specific to something like Roe v. Wade, but then I want to, transition to what this looks like for the queer community, but do we then see, do we actually put on the table picketing at churches as perhaps a tactic, which is probably uncomfortable for folks to even think about. But I suppose we're the queer community to be in that space.
Right.
Have you given any thought to what does offense look like?
I don't know what offense looks like in this. I think about the underground networks that will have to exist. I also think, some of the corporations have stepped forward and said, we'll pay for travel for our employees. I think that should be standard. And then when it starts affecting their pocketbook, then they'll maybe do something more on a statewide level. Colorado has its own little version right now of Don't Say Gay that's playing out at the State Board of Education. And in talking with people, initially when word got out what they were doing, there were lots of people on our side and people who don't like us down there testifying, some being moderated in their conversation, some being hysterical, some being angry. And I was talking to somebody and they're like, these people who make these decisions, this testimony doesn't impact them. And so I wonder why we spend so many resources on that when we would be better placed doing strategic planning around issues like that. I'm more on the fence. I've been to my share of protests. I'm sure I will go again. But being smart about how they're used and having something in mind, if we're going to do this, then what's the next step? And, it was when Obama won, when he and Hillary, he beat Hillary in the primary. And I had all these people Obama's going to change it all. Obama's going to change it all. And I'm like, he's only going to change it if you continue to show up. And it's like we're God, as human beings, it's like we do one thing and we think it's going to have all these impacts. It has to be a steady stream of one step after another. Showing up at the Women's March, what did it get us?
I've been thinking the same thing about the Supreme Court as well. What a mistake it has been for liberals, I suppose, to hang their hat on the Supreme Court for a handful of reasons. One is, I think arguments in front of the Supreme Court are all theater. The justices have made up their mind. We have this in our mind that we have some kind of a democracy where we go, we present, our arguments, we try to persuade each other, and that in that public square, we can actually do that. That when we show up at the public square, we can actually change minds. And I agree, but I think that at a certain level, we need to be much more realistic about the fact that like minds have been made up. And if we have waited to that point, we've lost, right?
Yep.
I think the justices have made up their mind. I think it's nice theater that we go and, we present our arguments in front of them. But I think the decision is preordained in most cases.
Yep.
Then I suppose the response to that is then the work needs to be done before that. And so I absolutely agree with you. It's just a matter of figuring out where does that work matter, right? Like where are we changing minds? And I'm not sure. I think maybe it circles back to, I don't think it's a good idea that we're leaving these places that are dangerous for us. I absolutely get it. And again, I did it.
I did it too.
I don't think that's helping. And also, I'm noticing that those of us that live in the really dark blue places, when things like, abortion, we're not really affected by it.
Correct.
And so we don't think about it very much. It's like unfortunate about Roe v. Wade, but it doesn't affect me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's really hard to organize folks in these super dark blue places that are super liberal, maybe have the money and the resources around things that just don't touch them or they think don't touch them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I don't know if you're running into that or if you experience that in any way.
I think, some of the narrative around, like in talking with people who, as I'm trying to raise resources, they're like, well, I don't use Out Boulder services.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it's important for me to give. And you can use the argument of helping your neighbor out in doing that. Some people do need our services. But to get to that core of our very existence is important. To have those conversations in a place where, like I can be married, I'm out with my family, my friends. I can walk down Pearl Street holding the hands of my boyfriend or my girlfriend and feel relatively safe. That complacency sets in fast and hard.
Mm-hmm.
And until, I have called for a revolution for years, and I thought we'd actually even get one during Occupy Wall Street. I was in New York City at the time. I'm like, we shut down Wall Street one day. I'm like, this is it, maybe. Like, this is maybe where everything gets laid bare. Well, there was no strong leader. Pretty soon it was save the whales, domestic violence, all the important stuff, but not one issue.
Mm.
And the organization, we still have what we have. And so I feel like it's similar right now in that there's not one person who anybody respects who could say the time is now for all of us from rural communities to move back home and work locally to make that the place that you want in the United States. Now that would change the world, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
Would it be safe for us? Probably not. Would it be impactful? Yes. Because I think it's about changing hearts and minds. And when we all leave, we don't change anybody's hearts or minds. It's just that Mardi Moore, she left town. I always knew she was a little different.
Yeah. And it also paints this thing. Like, I've always felt a bit like a coward, to be completely honest.
Mm-hmm. There
is this social thing that we do, which is like when we live in our, safe spaces, is we suddenly have a lot of pride and we suddenly have,
right.
We're outspoken, and there's a certain amount of kind of like these backwards folks that are still in these rural communities that, they don't know how to be gay, and they don't know how to, speak the language, or they don't know how to kind of address like some of the issues that we're confronting. They're backwards. And I've always also thought at the same time, they're actually some of the strongest people. Mm-hmm. And probably some of the people that we should be paying a bit more attention and reverence and be learning from. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of these two things that are happening is we leave and then we're strong. And then we also invisibilize the people that stay.
Yep.
But when you also say we need to move back to our communities, God, would I do it? I don't know.
Right. Well, maybe we take advantage of the fact that, a lot of us can do our jobs virtually. And, it wasn't like the people who were in New York City who like got out of the city. They just went upstate, right? They're probably not all from upstate. It would have been an opportunity to go back to your small little town, work from there, see what it's like, see how it could be better, try to make that change. And when you do that, then you start looking at all the intersectional things, right? The racism that's alive and well, the poverty that's alive and well. That would change so much if any of us had the courage to do it.
So if people are interested in helping, and maybe even this is specific to Out Boulder County, but if people are interested in helping, what can they be doing?
They can be registering to vote. They can do their research on candidates. They can talk to other people about registering to vote. And they can fund a queer organization. If you want to send money to Out Boulder County, we would love it. We would use it wisely. But in your own community, if they're like thinking about my hometown and staying on the vein of rural organizing, because I think that that's where the change has to happen. In Boulder, they're not going to vote down an LGBT issue. We don't even have to put one on the ballot, right? But you might just know, I remember as a kid, there was an intersex person. I didn't have the language. And I'm like, what's that about? No language for it, right? They used different language.
I remember hermaphrodite. People said
that was exactly what they called. Yep, that's the word they used. And that person needs support in your hometown. What's that look like? Does that mean the next time you're sitting at the local restaurant and somebody makes a snide comment that you stop it? Or when somebody says that person's a little light in their loafers, or the sissy word that's thrown around in those rural communities like crazy, that you stop it? I mean, that's stuff you can do. That doesn't cost you any money. So I think there's a number of things that we can do. We have to be vigilant in that the way that the direction of the country right now with the political power is that discrimination is going to continue. We haven't stopped it. Hate crimes will continue to spike. They began spiking when Donald Trump was president. They've slowed down a little bit, but after we saw the racist murders in Buffalo recently, the attacks on Jewish people, the people who hate the Jewish people, the African American people, the undocumented people, they hate the LGBTQ community too. So we're next. We moved into a new building, a beautiful new community center it's 9,500 square feet. It's 9 times the space we've ever had before. We have to raise $6 million to keep it and expand some things. But as soon as we signed the paper, and had a little celebration, then we had the police in to walk through the building and show us safe spaces to figure out if we had the right locks on the door. Our community is under attack, and people need to pay attention to that. And it starts with those ridiculous microaggressions that nobody calls them on.
What's something interesting that you've been reading or watching lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Oh, Sean, I check out after working all day long into true crime podcasts.
Really?
Oh my God. I am so hooked on them. So I haven't been doing I think the last book I read was State of Terror by Hillary Clinton. But I've gotten hooked during the pandemic. I got hooked on Liberty Puzzles and true crime podcasts. And it's a great checkout from the world for a few hours.
I am also into true crime podcasts.
You are?
Yes. Well, but here's the thing is like, it's such a rabbit hole because there are some that are really, really good. And then once you get through them, with me anyway, it's like this addiction of like, I have to find the next really good one, but they're not all cut from the same cloth. They're not all.
No, okay. So today I found a new one, same thing. Southern Fried True Crime. Check it out. I've been listening to it this morning. It's good.
Southern Fried True Crime. Okay. And also I'll have to look this one up, but I listened to one last year that I'll send you. You might have even listened to it, but it was about a murder in Australia in the 70s, or a woman went missing and like for 30 years, the family had the sense that it was her husband. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it was actually really good.
No, I haven't heard that. There's a really good one called Murder in Oregon, which got me hooked on podcasts. And it's, I think you can just find it in podcasts called Murder in Oregon.
Okay.
And it's about, I think I was even living in Seattle when it happened. Check it out.
Okay. I'm looking this up right now. So it's called The Teacher's Pet.
Okay.
Is the podcast.
I'm writing it down.
The podcast cracked it.
Wow.
It led to an arrest. So
wow.
That's satisfying.
Yeah, that is. That doesn't happen much. Yeah. No, I'm totally into, that's what I'm working in the yard, listening to that, going, oh, I'm in heaven.
I do the same thing. I work in the yard and I listen to these. And like, I have no one to talk to about it because like.
Right.
And then I like take off my headphones and I've been in a completely different world. And I'm like, oh, I live in a normal neighborhood with sun. Okay, Marty, that's all I've got. I really appreciate your time and your kind of thoughtful consideration and responses. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Out Boulder County is just one of thousands of organizations nationwide that are doing great work supporting queer communities. And as Marty said, one way to think about how to donate time, money, or resources, or to obtain support if you need it, is to consider the 3 levels: local, state, and national. If there's something happening in your town or in your state that's important to you, consider dedicating some resources to a local or state organization. If you're concerned about something happening at the national level or on an issue that transcends municipal boundaries, maybe consider donating your time or money, if you can, to a national organization. And if you'd like more information about Out Boulder County or would like to donate some money to support their programming, you can visit their website at www.outboulder.org. And if you have any questions or comments for me about anything, you can email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Join me next week when I'm chatting with Dr. David Ferris, a political scientist at Roosevelt University and the author of the book It's Time to Fight Dirty: How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. Chat soon, folks.